Hi everyone, Jason here from spiritualbabies.net. This is the third part of a series that we've done with our friend Rabbi Joshua Neely, and we did the Torah and we did the Mishnah, and now we're on to the Gemara, and we're going to just jump straight in. You'll see links on the page and under this video if you want to look at the previous two. Since recording those and where we are today, Florida and lots of places where Hurricane Matthew, are pleased to say that Rabbi Neely and his friends and family are all okay, which is excellent. So first, thank you and welcome back, and thank you for doing this with us. We really enjoyed the first two. I learned an awful lot. I'm sure the viewers have too. So we just back up a tiny part. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, and the Mishnah is the collected and codified, I suppose, ritual that's pulled from those books. Would that be fair?
Fair-ish.
Okay.
To just append to your Mishnah definition, the Mishnah is the codified, not codified, but the collected and refined teaching of how the oral understanding of the Torah was brought together. Right. So the Torah gives us the written law from God, and then like any other written text, it needs to be explained in order to actually be understood. And those explanations were transmitted over the centuries. By the time we reach the Mishnah, the rabbis felt at that time it was necessary to compile that explanation, the explanatory teaching, the footnotes that goes with the Torah, in order to preserve the best version of the teaching that was possible, in order to make it a little bit more travel friendly, as well as consistent, so that everyone was starting with the same explanatory notes.
But that collection of notes wasn't explicit enough. Would that be fair? Why do we have what is and why do we have this extra part in when you open up the Talmud? It's not just the Mishnah; it's just Gemara too. Why do we have it?
All right, so let's make sure for the other viewers out there we get our terms straight so that everyone knows what we're saying. So the Mishnah we've just talked about, and they can refer to the earlier video. The Gemara is the text that of the discussions around the Mishnah, and we'll go into more depth of exactly what that is, that was added and recorded from the time the Mishnah was done, roughly around 250 CE, until the time the Talmud was seen as done. And that, depending upon which section and which scholar you're looking at, is somewhere in the year between 500 and 700 CE. It's a fairly wide window for the actual final editing, redacting, finalization of the Talmud. And the Talmud then is the term that's used to describe the book in which you found both the Mishnah and the Gemara explaining it. So the Talmud is sort of the unified book. The Mishnah is one part, and the Gemara is one part. The Mishnah being the earlier level, and the Gemara being the later explanation of the Mishnah, kind of. Why do we need a Gemara? Why do we need this other layer? Well, there's a couple reasons. So one is, as I mentioned before, the Mishnah was itself always intended to just be the briefest explanatory notes to make sure people understood what the Torah said. And being brief, they themselves needed additional explanation that had been passed orally. Well, this is what this Mishnah actually means. This is what these shorthand phrases in the Mishnah are really talking about in more detail. So it was always expected, it wasn't an oversight, it was always expected that anybody teaching the Mishnah would say a sentence and then explain what that sentence meant. And then they would say the next sentence and explain what that sentence meant. And so that part of the Gemara was anticipated from the very first time the Mishnah itself was first written.
I just to try and illustrate that, a few years ago I got a cookbook from a second-hand store, and I brought it home and I tried some of the stuff out and nothing would work. And it's because I'd used 2 cups and it was specifically talking about 2 cups. And I didn't know how American cooking worked at that point. Here it was just pound and ounces, and I thought a cup. Well, a cup's a cup. Well, it isn't. It's like a specific American size.
Right.
And I assume that that's kind of how it works. You've got a series of instructions, but if you don't understand the logistics and the vocabulary and the glossary of terms, then you really can't unpack it properly.
Exactly. And part of the other job that the Gemara does is, as it's unpacking the Mishnah, it also gives explanation. Right? The Mishnah itself very rarely says, and this is why, this is what we do. It just says, this is it. Now, occasionally it will make reference to the verses in the Torah that it's talking about, or other logical point.
Your eggs are ready.
I was going to say, speaking of cooking, it'll rarely make reference to the logical steps that it used to justify the positions that it holds. Most of the time it just says, this is it. The Gemara provides a lot more of that back explanation of saying, so this is why the Mishnah is the way it is. This is what the Mishnah is based on. This is the logical steps that are necessary. It'll also come up with the logical defense to questions that later students might have had of, well, why wasn't it different? And so it will provide the answer to challenges of, well, why should the Mishnah be like this? Don't we have another text that says such? And that really became, was originally one of the most important parts of the Gemara. It's one that's often downplayed now because we live 1,000, 2,000 years after the fact. But the Gemara was also very important as being the defense of the Mishnah as Mishnah. Because as the Gemara was being written, as it was being used, as it was a living document at the time, right after the Mishnah was first redacted, there were other competing traditions. Right? Remember from our Mishnah discussion, the Mishnah itself was the most refined and perfect form of those explanatory notes, the oral law. But there were lots of other versions out there that sought to teach the same things as the Mishnah, but did it in different phrasing and different styles. Well, those didn't disappear just because the Mishnah was finished. They were still being shared among different schools of thought. They were still being practiced by many different people. They were still being remembered. And many of those are brought into the Talmud to be examined. So they say, okay, we have the Mishnah, and here we have a Breita. A Breita is a piece of rabbinic text that is older than the Gemara. It's usually from around the time of the Mishnah. And it may or may not seem to jive with the Mishnah that we have. And so much of the Talmud is spent saying, what do we do with this over here? Because we got some other rabbi who taught this, and it's not in the Mishnah, but it sounds like it's relevant to the topic that we're discussing. How do we handle it? And oftentimes they will try to reconcile them and say, oh no, different wording, but the same conclusion. Sometimes they will say, well, that is talking about a different subcategory. You know, this Mishnah is talking about a general case, and this is talking about a very particular case. And so it doesn't challenge the Mishnah directly. Sometimes they will say, no, you know what? That's wrong. That one was brought up and rejected, and that's why it's not in the Mishnah. And then other times they will bring it up and say, actually, that Breita is kind of okay, but you've probably learned it wrong. Here, let me adjust that word for you. And let me just tweak it a little bit. There, that's the real way the Breita was supposed to be remembered. And now you can see it matches the Mishnah just fine, and we're all happy.
When you say we, you're speaking about a series of sages or different, because I know there are conversations, aren't there, that go on actually kind of between different spaces in time between different people. So the Gemara is made up of different voices. Who do those voices belong to?
So the voices in the Mishnah are called the Tanaim. If you are living during that period and you are one of the sages, the rabbis, you are called a Tana. During the Gemara period, you are called an Amora. And so they are called the Amoraim. And the Amoraim are the later great rabbis of the communities of the people of Israel, and we should probably talk about the difference between the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud at some point. So make sure we get back to that. But they are the leaders of those communities, the ones who are still responsible for teaching Jewish law, for ensuring that it is implemented properly, of ruling on cases of property and criminal courts and all sorts of other things. So they are still implementing the law on a day-to-day basis and still teaching it. And they still have to field the questions from their students and the broader population. And they have to make sure that it's still functioning, it's still working. And that's one of the Talmud's second main jobs. So the first main job is really, I guess we're onto our list. Let's be accurate. It's our third job. The first job is to simply do the normal explanation of a text. Here's the Mishnah. This is what the Mishnah actually means, because you wouldn't have got it just by yourself reading the Mishnah, any more than the Mishnah believes you could just understand the Torah by only reading it. The second job is to reconcile the Mishnah with all of the other proto-rabbinic texts, what we call Braitot, the other teachings that were floating around within the community that weren't in the Mishnah, but seemed awfully parallel to the Mishnah. So that was its second job. Its third job was to take the Mishnah, which meant also the Torah, and say, but how does that work here? How does that work in our different set of circumstances? Or how does it work now that somebody has invented this new item? Or how does that work now that the arrangement of the nations has changed? How do we apply everything that's come before to our current contemporary situations? And in many ways, that became the most important part of the Talmudic project. The most lasting effect of the Gemara, apart from explanation and homogenization of rabbinic text, was to create a certain methodology, a certain worldview, a certain mental process that we use to understand our contemporary world through the lens of Torah and Mishnah and just generally Judaism, that is consistent enough in its application that the results are recognizably Jewish, no matter where you live and no matter how much or how little connection you have to Jews living in other parts of the world. So the Talmud became this incredibly important device when Jews began to get more and more dispersed at this time in world history, to keep a consistent process that yielded consistent results that allowed us to remain as a unified people despite being so separated by space and then later by so separated in time.
So in today's context, I suppose someone invents a microwave and the question would be, is using a microwave considered to be cooking? Is it considered to be lighting a fire? And so the Talmud scholar would be the person that uses the Talmud as a filter and pulls relevant arguments out based on his knowledge of how a microwave works and what its purpose is to come up with an answer that people can then implement in their daily lives.
A wonderful example, yes. If you're getting into an airplane, how does that work when it comes to Shabbat? How does it work when it comes to for tefillah? Is it morning? Is it afternoon? Is it evening? All of those questions are very new. And there were lots of new questions in the ancient world as well, or classical world that came after the ancient world that needed additional explanation and analysis. And it was the Talmud that had created this mental framework, this way of asking the questions, of looking for certain types of proof, of using certain logical constructions in order to have answers that were considered to be derived from a Jewish source, rather than just, well, you know what, I think it should be this. That doesn't fly in Judaism. It's you have to you have to show your work, and the work has to be in a certain style in order to be following this tradition, in order that it's considered to actually be linked one decision to one decision to one decision all the way back, ultimately into the Torah, so that no decision, no application seems like you're just plucking it out of thin air.
So you mentioned there were two different types of Talmud and two different Gemaras, I think.
Yes.
Do they come to this? A better question is, we've got two different books, One of them is obviously more popular than the other one. Are these books of answers, or are they books of how to ask questions?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
It's always one of those. I appreciate
So
it.
they are books of analysis. That's the thing. It's I often give a comparison. If what is it in the UK? The Hansard, is it? In America, it's called the Congressional Record, which is a record of the actual debates and discussions around legislation. And it can be very useful if you are a scholar, or if you were going to be a judge, to actually read, well, what were the legislatures thinking when they passed that law? And I don't just mean what were they thinking. I mean, what was the actual thought process? What was their intent, and what was the meaning behind the words they chose to put the law together? And if you want to know how to apply the law, or how to apply the law in new situations that they had not covered, you really need to read through this. In an American example, the Talmud in some respects is very similar to a work called the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were a record of the debates and essays that were around the U.S. Constitution before it had become the Constitution. And many people will constantly go back to this work and say, okay, so when we read, you have the right to this, or the president has this, authority or not this authority. What were they really thinking when they said that? And the Federalist Papers is one of the first places you go to get some of the opinions about what was behind these decisions. And the Gemara provides that, which is why, let me just take a breath, which is why you have the Talmud that was written slightly earlier, the Gemara from the Jewish community in the land of Israel, what's often referred to as the Jerusalem Talmud now. It used to be called the Palestinian Talmud until current events overtook us, and the word Palestine was no longer just the Roman word for our previous territory, but became a political term for a modern group of people. So now we just generally refer to it as the Jerusalem Talmud. Even though it wasn't written in Jerusalem, it was compiled up in Tiberias in the north of Israel. Jerusalem was a no-go area. We were not allowed to be in Jerusalem except on Tisha B'Av, on the day of mourning. So the sages of Israel put their analysis down for that period of time. And this was around 350, 400, 450. The sages who were in the Babylonian communities, which eventually were considered to be greater. They were more able to. They were able to devote more time. They were able to raise more students, and they had a sharper ability to analyze the Mishnah and the law in its underpinnings. They created their own version of the Gemara, their own explanation of the Mishnah, and that became known as the Babylonian Talmud, the Bavli. Even though, again, the Babylonian Empire did not exist, it's just that's what we called that part of the world. It was actually under Persian and then later under the Muslim world that the Babylonian Talmud was finished.
Maybe just wondering why they were considered superior, perhaps because they didn't live in the land and there was more influence on how do we live in diaspora and how do we make these rules.
Partly.
It's easier to eat vegetarian if you're in a vegetarian restaurant than it is to...
Certainly. Than to only go to the salad bar.
Right.
Certainly that is true. The Talmuds themselves in later rabbinic analysis provides another explanation, which is they stood on the shoulders of the previous generations, right? So the benefit of being second is you have the first version sitting there in front of you, and you can use it to start, and then you can add your own analysis, which can go further. So, it's kind of like asking why did Albert Einstein come up with the theory of relativity rather than Isaac Newton? Well, because Einstein had Newton to work off of, and if Newton had Newton, he might have come up with it too. So it's not just to denigrate the earlier sages for the Jerusalem Talmud, but to say thanks to their work, the Babylonian scholars were able to reach even further into a more refined and precise analysis. And that's one of the hallmark differences between their two texts, is the Babylonian Talmud shows the hand of consistent editing much more heavily than the Jerusalem Talmud. So the technical terminology of the debate, the stylization of this is this type of attack that's going to be parried by that type of attack, and really fencing analogy is very appropriate here, is much clearer in the Babylonian Talmud. Multiple generations had very consciously gone through this record of the debate and discussion and had cleaned it up to make sure that it would be very clear exactly what the steps were in the thought process and the steps were in the arguments, even as you pointed out, that stretched over a couple hundred years, with people who never sat in the same room, but to bring together their different points of view to see how they interacted and then reach something like a conclusion. That whole process is done much more clearly and explicitly in the Babylonian Talmud than it is in the Jerusalem one.
So here we are. It's 2016. Are there areas of the Talmud? Because I know there are huge oceans of people that are just having a dialogue on a certain thing. It doesn't seem to come to a conclusion. Are there any? And nothing came after, right? We don't have a Talmud 2.0 where people sat down and had a look again. So are there any areas in today's modern Jewish life which weren't brought to a good conclusion in a Talmud? And if there are, how do people make decisions today? Or why were choices made if there wasn't a definitive answer in a text?
So the lack of definitive answer in the Talmud is a bit of a canard. The Talmud is actually very good about laying out the whole argument. And the generations that came immediately after the Talmud, the Sevarim and the Gaonim, they knew what the answers were. They knew who had won those long arguments. It was very clear to them what the final opinions were, even if it wasn't written in giant scoreboard lights, Rabbah won. They knew who had been victorious in the back and forth, what's called the shaklavataria, the give and take of the debate. And when you read through their writings, there is just incredible consistency of exactly how to apply it. And the generations that came after the Talmud were very good about codifying and compiling and answering questions very, very consistently in a way that showed everyone knew what the answers were in the Talmud. There were very, very few, very, very generally minor cases where they would say, you know what, this is an outstanding question that is going to have to be left outstanding until we can get more information from the power that be, meaning the days of the Messiah. So we're just going to have to leave it there. We can't come to a resolution on this point. But those are very few and far between. People often really do overstate and mischaracterize the Talmud as not coming to conclusions. I agree that for a first-time reader, it doesn't look like there was a conclusion. It looks like they just moved on. But there was a resolution there. You just didn't notice it. And that's part of reading the later materials that help you understand the Talmud the same way the Talmud helps you understand the Mishnah, the same way the Mishnah helps you understand the Torah. So it did go on to be very, very consistent. So in the modern world, are there any things that the Talmud itself didn't cover? Of course. Microwaves, computers, organ donation, laser surgery, space travel. Of course, the Talmud did not talk about any of those things explicitly, not even on their radar of being a possible topic in their future. But the great thing about the Talmud is that it is more than just a codification of law. It is a set of tools for analysis in order to produce consistently Jewish results. And so the sages of every generation, as new things developed, would go back to the Talmud, would go back to the methodology, would go back to its framework of thinking, and ask questions in ways that would be able to that would allow us to look at the world into Talmudic categories and say, what is this most similar to? What principles that we understand from the Talmud, based in the Mishnah, based in the Torah, what principles do we have that could help us understand how this works? How do we handle corporations Well, corporations are very similar to some of the partnership agreements that were talked about in the Talmud and Mishnah. So we can develop a law there. How do we handle complex financial instruments? Well, they had their own complex financial instruments, and let's look at the underlying principles they outlined and apply them to modern ones. How do we handle organ transplant? How do we handle surgery, microwaves, electricity, all these things? There are embedded principles within the Talmud that can be used to answer all of these questions once we bring in a proper physical understanding of the most recent things. Let me give you just one concrete example, which is in vitro fertilization. Not exactly the kind of thing that was happening 2,000 years ago, not the kind of thing that was happening 200 years ago. So how in the world can we use Jewish law and Talmud to understand in vitro fertilization? One of the big questions that came up with the first in vitro fertilization from Jewish sources was, what is the Jewish status of a child born through in vitro fertilization? Does it have the Jewish status of the genetic parents, in particular the genetic mother, or does it have the Jewish status of the birth mother, the surrogate who actually carried the child to term? And the rabbis who first looked at this said, well, you know what? Funny you should ask that, because there's a section in the Talmud that talks about the moving of a fetus from one womb to another womb.
Why would that have been
Exactly right. Why would they have talked about it? They talked about a fetus of a cow that had been taken by a mouse or weasel, depending upon your translation, and then put into the womb of another cow. Now, biologically impossible, right? You can't just, bonk, pull a fetus out of one cow and put it into another womb.
A mouse would never be able to carry that kind of thing.
Exactly. It's an unladen swallow. It doesn't really work. But they talked about it nonetheless. And the Talmud does a lot of talk on the fringes of the possible, because that's where you often encounter the clearest lines of what is actually going on with the law, right? The everyday 24/7, normal cases, they don't tell you so much, but push it right to the edge of what's possible. And now you begin to see that sort of crystal clear thing. It's sort of like if you have a piece of cloth. If you just hang it, a little distance in front of you, you can't see through it. But if you put your face right up to it and stretch it, then you can start to see through the warp and woof and begin to make out the actual limits of what's beyond it. And so that's what they did in this case. And that ruling on the fetus transferal within cows became the initial, the launching point for understanding in vitro fertilization and Jewish identity. And it was because we had that embedded principle within the Talmud to work off of.
What was the conclusion? Do you remember?
The conclusion is that it goes off the actual birth mother, right? And that's actually become a very important point in modern Judaism as a whole, of continuing to reinforce that Judaism is not a genetic condition, that Judaism is a familial condition. It is something that you are born to, yes, but not because of your gene, but because of the family in which you are born. And so therefore, you follow the actual birth mother. So a non-Jewish egg, an egg from a non-Jewish woman that is implanted within a Jewish woman is considered to be a Jewish child when it is born. And vice versa. A Jewish egg, again, from a woman who is Jewish, implanted into a non-Jewish surrogate mother, when the child is born, the child is not considered Jewish and is taken to the mikveh if it's going to be the child of the genetic parents. Uniquely among Jewish books, the Talmud is attacked by people left, right, and center. It is used as an attack against us by anti-Semites. The Talmud was banned in many European countries, and it was burnt. And Jews were prohibited from studying it, even when we were allowed to do other forms of Jewish life. The Talmud has uniquely attracted the interest of those who hate traditional Judaism. And I've never been 100% sure why uniquely this would be that, because the Talmud, in my opinion, is a beautiful marriage of this living debate and this analysis and logic, together with some of the most important theological and philosophical discussions that we see in the ancient world. But I think part of it is because of the Talmud's effect. The Talmud has a unique impact on Jewish life thereafter. And it's not something that it created, but it is something that it preserved. And it was this living debate, this living dedication to robust discussion and grounded analysis that said, I don't care who your father is. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care how pious you look. Put your ideas on the table. I will put mine on the table next to you, and we will work it out to see which set of ideas is most correct. And once we do that, we will shake hands, and we will take the best of our two ideas, and we will move on to a better and better understanding of God and our place in this world. And that form of living is, I think, very threatening to many, many people. And because many people want clarity. They want the answer. They want the authentic, the original, the first. And we've seen this instinct over and over again, not just in the Jewish world, but in the world at large. And the Talmud says, no, that's not the way it works. You don't get closer to God by going further and further back. You get closer to God by refining more and more and more with the benefit of experience and history and this analysis. And so we are able to understand Jewish law better now than they were 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. And that's something that, as a vision of hope and of aspiration, that the Talmud preserved. Just as things were really starting to fall apart for a little while in the Jewish world, it preserved this vision that together and with civility, we will get better and better at doing this thing we call life and doing it according to Torah. And that is something that if we hadn't had, I shudder to think of where Judaism would have ended up.
Perfect. What a great ending. Or beginning, depending on your perspective. All right, that's great. Thank you for this. If you've enjoyed this at home and you'd like us to tackle different subjects, leave your comments in the box below and we'll have a look through and pick the best ones. Thank you very much, Rabbi Neely, for giving us all your time over these 3 episodes. It's been
Thank you.
Hugely instructive for everybody. And thank you guys at home for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can check out Rabbi Neely's he does series on the Mishnah. It's brilliant Torah classes every week as well. There'll be a link to his channel under this video. And we'll see you all again very soon, I'm sure.
Although technically, I should point out, and maybe you're going to edit this back in, the Talmud itself is written in both Hebrew and Aramaic.
Aramaic, right.
Because the Aramaic was the language of the common person. It would be the equivalent of writing a book in both Hebrew and English in the modern American context. So maybe you should squeeze in somewhere that the Talmud was supposed to be understood by everyone in the common language. It was not meant to be a secret book.
Excellent. I'll clip that out and put it in.
You know, the layout that most people think of when they imagine a page of Talmud is relatively recent, but it was a great invention. During the classical period and during the Middle Ages, for most people, if you wanted to study someone's commentary on the Talmud, or if you wanted to look up a verse that the Talmud was talking about, you would have to have 2, 3, 4 other books all open at the same time. And you would be flipping back and forth and and it would be very, very hard. And then when the printing press began, some very, very brilliant printers realized that if you just put the text in the middle, you could add parenthetical commentary around the sides. So you could have Rashi, you could have the Tosafot, 2 of the major contributors to Talmudic understanding. And then you could even have a key and an index to where to go into the law codes to see where this was applied if you wanted to know the score of what the answer was. And you could have verse lookups for all the places in the Torah or the rest of Tanakh to look things up. It was an amazing insight and an amazing invention that allowed Talmud study to get even stronger and stronger and more accessible.
Yes, as you were talking about it made me think of Wikipedia, and it's an accessible series of information for anybody to go
Right.
and have a look. Even if they don't really understand it, you've got the option of getting information without having to, regardless of your schooling, there's a possibility to look for a way of finding an answer, and that's hugely
And the
valuable.
right, and the cross-referencing was very, very important. I mean, that all of Jewish learning and scholarship was about cross-referencing. You know, if I want to understand one verse in the Torah, I have to understand another verse and put them together. And if I want to understand one Mishnah, I have to understand another Mishnah. And then the Talmud just does that, times 10. And so then to build this into the whole page of having those cross-references right there to encourage looking up all those other pieces and seeing where the tangents lead you, it just blew the doors open.
Lovely. All right, I think we're done. That's really awesome. I was wondering about what to do.